This is Greg Strange at the Institute of Directors with reaction to Alistair Darling's budget, and with me is the IOD Chief Economist, Graeme Leach. Now, Graeme, you're not entirely happy. In fact, you're very unhappy with what Mr Darling had to announce. Why?
Just the sheer scale of borrowing. The Chancellor announced today he's going to borrow £700 billion between now and 2014. What's more, the £700 billion figure is based on very optimistic GDP growth assumptions. In other words, if economic growth is less, borrowing is going to be even more. And in a worst case scenario, we could be looking at £1 trillion of borrowing over the next 5 years. Enormous numbers, not sustainable. Something's got to give. And really, we didn't see the give this afternoon. It's been left till after the next election.
Now, one of the things he's saying is that recovery will begin before the end of this year, and he's been quite chipper about the level of recovery next year. Does he know something that the rest of us don't? Are there some green shoots out there?
There's huge uncertainty regarding when the recovery will occur and the nature of the recovery. But I think what worries me today is that the Chancellor sees a sort of U-shaped bounce back. It's not a classic V-shaped recovery, but it's a U-shaped recovery. Whereas we think it's more likely to be an L-shaped recovery. In other words, only a very gentle gradient up. And of course, if that's the case, then his borrowing is going to be even more than he says. So there's a huge amount of optimism built in there. And of course, our fear is that eventually, when realism is faced up to, then the adjustment will fall on the side of higher taxation. It won't be due to reduced spending. The government has announced a further squeeze on public spending today. They have tightened, but it's still not tight enough. We say that in these extraordinary times where you've got massive deficits, then once the recovery is underway, we've got to see one of the biggest fiscal squeezes in history. We've got to see a real freeze in spending for the next decade. Even then, we end up with budget deficits which are pretty significant, but it averts the alternative, which is a huge increase in the size of the state, which we're stuck with for a generation.
Well, there's going to be an election sometime in the next 14 odd months or so. And of course, Mr Darling might not be the Chancellor for these successive years when you see so much work still to be done.
Well, absolutely, and someone might be cynical and say it was a political budget in those terms. But the reality is, regardless whoever wins the next election, what the IOD wants to see is the emphasis on less public spending as opposed to more taxation. Because the higher taxation rises, the weaker long-term economic growth is going to be. So basically, if we don't squeeze the size of the state will squeeze the size of the economy.